Chapter 3 The Royal Daughters-in-Law. The basket perfumed the air about it with a delicious odor of hot flour, butter, and honey. "Hot pancakes! There won't be enough to go round. Come on, citizens, eat up! Hot pancakes!" cried the merchant, busy behind his open-air stove. He seemed to be doing a great many things at the same time, rolling out his paste, removing the cooked pancakes from the fire, giving change, and keeping an eye on the street urchins to see they did not rob his stove. "Hot pancakes!" He was so busy that he paid no particular attention to the customer who, extending a white hand, placed a denier on the board in payment for a small pancake. He saw only the left hand put the wafer, from which but a single bite had been taken, down again. "Well, he's a fussy one," he said, poking the fire. "To hell with him, it's pure wheat and flour and butter from Vaugirard." At that moment he looked up and was startled out of his wits. On seeing who the customer was, his words were stifled in his throat. He saw a very tall man with huge, unblinking eyes, wearing a white hood and a half-length tunic. Before even the merchant could manage a bow or stammer out an excuse, the man in the white hood had already moved away. The confectioner, with hanging arms, watched him disappear into the crowd, while his latest batch of pancakes began to burn. The business streets of the city, according to travelers in Africa and the Orient, were at that time very similar to the souks of an Arab town. The same incessant din, little stalls touching one another, odors of frying fat, spices, and leather, the same slow promenading of shoppers and loungers, the same difficulty in forcing a way through the crowd. Each street, each alley, had its own special brand of goods, its own particular trade. Here, in the back shops, weavers' shuttles went to and fro upon the looms. There, cobblers sat at their lasts. Farther on, saddlers tugged at their awls, and beyond again, the carpenters turned the legs of stools. There was a street of birds, a street of herbs and vegetables, a street of smiths whose hammers resounded upon their anvils, while their braziers glowed at the back of their workshops. The goldsmiths, working at their crucibles, were gathered along the quay that bore their name. There were thin ribbons of sky between the houses which were built of wood or mud, their gables so close together that one could shake hands from window to window across the street. Almost everywhere the ground was covered with a stinking film of mud in which people walked, either barefoot, in wooden clogs, or in leather shoes, according to their condition. The man with the tall shoulders and the white hood walked slowly on through the mob, his hands clasped behind his back, apparently careless of being jostled. Many, indeed, made way for him and saluted him. He responded with a curt nod. He had the appearance of an athlete, fair silky hair, almost auburn in color and curling at the ends, fell nearly to his collar, framing regular features which were at once impassive and singularly beautiful. 3 royal sergeants-in-arms, in blue coats and carrying in the crooks of their arms the staves surmounted with lilies that were the insignia of their office, followed the stroller at a distance, but without ever losing sight of him, stopping when he stopped, moving on again as soon as he did. Suddenly a young man in a tight-fitting tunic, dragged along by 3 fine greyhounds on a leash, debouched from an alley, jostling the stroller and very nearly knocking him over. The hounds became entangled about his feet and began barking. "You scoundrel!" the young man cried in a noticeably Italian accent. "You nearly trod on my hounds. I wouldn't have cared a damn if they'd bitten you." No more than 18, short and good-looking, with dark eyes and finely chiseled features, the young man stood his ground in the middle of the street, raising his voice in simulated manliness. Someone took him by the arm and whispered a word in his ear. At once the young man removed his cap, bowing respectfully, though without servility. "Those are fine hounds. Whose are they?" asked the stroller, gazing at the boy out of huge, cold eyes. "They belong to my uncle Ptolemy, the banker, at your service," replied the young man. Without another word, the man in the white hood went on his way. As soon as he and the sergeants at arms who followed him were out of sight, the people standing round the young Italian guffawed. The latter stood still, apparently having some difficulty in recovering himself after his mistake. Even the hounds were still. "Well, well, he's not so proud now," they said, laughing. "Look at him, he nearly knocks the king down and then adds insult to injury. You can count on spending the night in prison, my boy, with 30 strokes of the whip into the bargain." The Italian turned upon the bystanders. "Damn it, I'd never seen him before. How could I be expected to recognize him? And what's more, citizens, I come from a country where there's no king for whom one has to make way. In my city of Siena, every citizen can be king in turn, and if anyone feels like mocking Guccio Baglioni, he need only say the word." He uttered the name like a challenge. The quick pride of Tuscany shone in his eyes. A carved dagger hung at his side. No one persisted, and the young man flicked his fingers to put the hounds in motion again. He went on his way with more apparent assurance than he felt, wondering whether his stupidity would have unpleasant consequences. For it was indeed King Philip the Fair whom he had jostled. This sovereign, whom none other equaled in power, liked to stroll through his city like a simple citizen, informing himself upon prices, tasting foodstuffs, examining cloth, listening to people talking. He was taking the pulse of his people. Strangers, ignorant of who he was, asked him the way. One day a soldier had stopped him to ask for his pay. As mean with words as he was with money, it was rare that in a whole outing he said more than 3 sentences or spent more than 3 pence. The king was passing through the meat market when the great bell of Notre Dame began ringing and a loud clamor arose. "There they are! There they are!" people were shouting. The clamor drew nearer. The crowd became excited. People began to run. A fat butcher came out from behind his stall, knife in hand, and yelled, "Death to the heretics!" His wife caught him by the sleeve. "Heretics? They're no more heretics than you are," she said. "You do better to stay here and serve the shop, you idler, you." They began quarreling. A crowd gathered at once. "They've confessed before the judges," the butcher went on. "The judges?" someone replied. "They've always been the same ones. They judge as they're told to by those who pay them, and they're afraid of a kick up the arse." Then everyone began to talk at once. "The Templars are saintly men. They've always given a lot to charity. It was a good thing to take their money away, but not to torture them. It was the king who owed them most. That's why it was." "The king did the right thing." "The king or the Templars," said an apprentice. "They're one and the same thing. Let the wolves eat each other, and then they won't eat us." At that moment a woman happened to turn round, grew suddenly pale, and made a sign to the others to be quiet. Philip the Fair was standing behind them, gazing at them with his unwinking, icy stare. The sergeants at arms had drawn a little closer to him, ready to intervene. In an instant the crowd had dispersed. Those who had composed it ran off shouting at the tops of their voices, "Long live the king! Death to the heretics!" The king's expression remained perfectly impassive. One might have thought that he had heard nothing. If he took pleasure in taking people by surprise, it was a secret pleasure. The clamor was growing louder. The procession of the Templars was passing the end of the street. Through a gap between the houses, the king saw for an instant the Grand Master standing in the wagon, surrounded by his 3 companions. The Grand Master stood upright. In the king's eyes this was an irritation. He looked like a martyr, but undefeated. Leaving the crowd to rush towards the spectacle, Philip the Fair passed through the suddenly empty streets at his usual slow pace, and returned to his palace. The people might well grumble a bit, and the Grand Master hold his old and broken body upright. In an hour the whole thing would be over, and the sentence, so the king believed, would be generally well received. In an hour's time the work of 7 years would be finished and completed. The episcopal tribunal had issued their decree. The archers were numerous. The sergeants-at-arms patrolled the streets. In an hour the case of the Templars would be erased from the list of public cares, and from every point of view the royal power would come out of the affair, enhanced and reinforced. Even my daughter Isabella will be satisfied. I shall have acceded to her plea, and so contented everyone. But it was time to put an end to it, Philip the Fair told himself as he thought of the words he had just heard. He went home by the Mercer's Hall. Philip the Fair had entirely renovated and rebuilt the palace, preserving only such ancient structures as the Sainte-Chapelle, which dated from the time of his grandfather, St. Louis. It was a period of building and embellishment. Princes rivaled each other. What had been done in Westminster had been done in Paris too. The mass of the Cité, with its great white towers dominating the Seine, was brand new, imposing, and, perhaps, a little ostentatious. Philip, if he watched the pennies, had never hesitated to spend largely when it was a questioning of demonstrating his power. But, since he never neglected an opportunity of profit, he had conceded to the mercers, in consideration of an enormous rent, the privilege of transacting business in the great gallery which ran the length of the palace, and which from this fact was known as the Mercer's Hall, before it became known as the Merchant's Hall. It was a huge place with something of the appearance of a cathedral with 2 naves. Its size was the admiration of travelers. At the summits of the pillars were the 40 statues of the kings who, from Pharamond and Mérovée, had succeeded each other at the head of the Frankish kingdom. Opposite the statue of Philip the Fair was that of Engrand de Marigny, coadjutor and rector of the kingdom, who had inspired and directed the building. Round the pillars were stalls containing articles of dress. There were baskets of trinkets, and sellers of ornaments, embroidery, and lace. About them were gathered the pretty Parisian women and the ladies of the court. Open to all corners, the hall had become a place for a stroll, a meeting place for transacting business and exchanging gallantries. It resounded with laughter, conversation, and gossip, with the claptrap of the salesmen over all. There were many foreign accents, particularly those of Italy and Flanders. A raw-boned fellow, who had determined to make his fortune out of spreading the use of handkerchiefs, was demonstrating the articles to a group of fat women, shaking out his squares of ornamented linen. "Ah, my dear ladies," he cried, "what a pity to blow one's nose in one's fingers or upon one's sleeve, when such pretty handkerchiefs as these have been invented for the purpose. Are not such elegant things precisely made for your ladyship's noses?" A little farther on, an old gentleman was being pressed to buy a wench some English lace. Philip the Fair crossed the hall. The courtiers bowed to the ground. The women curtsied as he passed. Without seeming to do so, the king liked the liveliness of the scene, the laughter, and as well as the marks of respect which gave him assurance of his power. Here, because of the tumult of voices, the great bell of Notre Dame seemed distant, lighter in tone, more benign. The king caught sight of a group whose youth and magnificence were the cynosure of every eye. It consisted of 2 quite young women and a tall, fair, good-looking young man. The young women were 2 of the king's daughters-in-law, those known as the Sisters of Burgundy, Jeanne, the Countess of Poitiers, married to the king's 2nd son, and Blanche, her younger sister, married to the youngest son. The young man with them was dressed like an officer of a princely household. They were whispering together with restrained excitement. Philip the Fair slowed his pace the better to observe his daughters-in-law. "My sons have no reason to complain of me," thought Philip the Fair. "As well as making alliances useful to the crown, I gave them very pretty wives." The 2 sisters were very little alike. Jeanne, the elder, the wife of Philippe of Poitiers, was 21 years old. She was tall and slender, her hair somewhere between blonde and chestnut, and something in the way she held herself, something formal about the line of her neck and the slant of the eye, line of the neck and the slant of the eye reminded the king of the fine greyhounds in his kennels. She dressed with a simplicity and sobriety that was almost an affectation. This particular day she was wearing a long dress of grey velvet with tight sleeves. Over it she wore a surcoat edged with ermine, reaching to the waist. Her sister Blanche was smaller, rounder, rosier, with great spontaneity. Though she was only 3 years younger than Jean, she still had childish dimples in her cheeks, and, doubtless, they would remain there for some time yet. Her hair was of a bright blonde, and her eyes, and this is rare, were of a clear and brilliant brown. She had small translucent teeth. Dress was more to her than a game. It was a passion. She devoted herself to it with an extravagance that was not always in the best of taste. She wore enormous pleated coifs, and hung as many jewels as she could upon her collar, sleeves, and belt. Her dresses were embroidered with pearls and gold thread, but she was so graceful that everything could be forgiven her, and appeared so pleased with herself that it was a pleasure to see. The little group was talking a matter of 5 days. "Is it reasonable to be so concerned about a mere 5 days?" said the Countess of Poitiers, at the moment the king emerged from behind a pillar masking his approach. "Good morning, my daughters," he said. The 3 young people fell suddenly silent. The good-looking boy bowed low and moved a pace or 2 aside with his eyes upon the ground, as befitted his rank. The 2 young women, having made their curtsies, became tongue-tied, blushing and a little embarrassed. They looked as if they had been caught out. "Well, my daughters," the king went on, "one might well think that I had arrived at an inappropriate moment. What were you saying to each other?" He was not surprised at his reception. He was accustomed to the fact that everyone, even his greatest friends, even his closest relations, were intimidated by his presence. He was often surprised by the wall of ice that fell between him and everyone who came near him. All, that is, except Marigny and Nogaret, and he found it difficult to explain away the terror that seized strangers whom he happened to meet. Indeed, he believed he did everything possible to appear pleasant and amiable. He wanted to be loved and feared at the same time, and it was asking too much. Blanche was the first to recover her assurance. "You must forgive us, sire," she said, "but it is not an easy thing to repeat." "Why not?" asked Philip the Fair. "Because we were saying unkind things about you," Blanche replied. "Really?" said Philip, uncertain whether she was teasing, astonished that anyone should dare tease him. He glanced at the young man, standing a little apart, who seemed very ill at ease. Jerking his chin towards him, he said, "Who is he?" "Monsieur Philippe Donnet, equerry to our uncle Valois, who has lent him to me as an escort," replied the Countess of Poitiers. The young man bowed once again. For an instant the idea crossed the king's mind that his sons were wrong to permit their wives to go abroad accompanied by such good-looking equerries, and that the old-fashioned custom, which insisted that princesses should be accompanied by ladies-in-waiting, had undoubtedly a good deal of sense to it. "Haven't you a brother?" he asked the equerry. "Yes, sire. My brother is in the service of Monseigneur of Poitiers." He asked the equerry. "Yes, sire, my brother is in the service of Monseigneur of Poitiers," answered young Aunay, bearing the king's gaze with some discomfort. "That's it, I always confuse you," said the king. Then, turning back to Blanche, he said, "Well then, what unkind things were you saying of me, my girl?" "Jean and I are in complete agreement that we owe you a grudge, father. For 5 consecutive nights we have not had our husbands at our service, because you keep them in council or send them far away on affairs of state." "My dear daughters, these are not matters to be spoken of out loud," said the king. He was a prude by nature, and it was said he had remained chaste for all the 9 years that he had been a widower. But he could not be severe with Blanche. Her liveliness, her gaiety, her daring, to say the least, disarmed him. He was at once amused and shocked. He smiled, which was a thing that hardly happened to him once a month. "And what does the third one say?" he added. By the third one, he meant Marguerite of Burgundy, the cousin of Jean and Blanche, who was married to his eldest son, Louis, King of Navarre. "Marguerite!" cried Blanche. "She's shut herself up. She's sulking, and she says that you're as wicked as you're good-looking." Once more the king found himself in uncertainty, wondering how he should interpret the last phrase. But Blanche's expression was so limpid, so candid. She was the only person who dared tease him, the only person who did not tremble in his presence. "Well, you can reassure her, and reassure yourself, Blanche. Louis and Charles can keep you company tonight. Today is a good day for the kingdom," said Philip the Fair. "There will be no council tonight. As for your husband, Jean, I can tell you that he'll be home tomorrow and that he has forwarded our affairs in Flanders. I am pleased with him." "Then I shall make him doubly welcome," said Jean, inclining her beautiful neck. This conversation was a peculiarly long one for King Philip. He turned quickly away without saying goodbye, and went towards the grand staircase which led to his apartments. said Blanche, her hand to her heart as she watched him disappear. "We were lucky to get away with it that time." "I thought I should faint with terror," said Jean. Philippe Daunet was blushing to the roots of his hair, not from embarrassment as a moment ago, but from anger. "Thank you," he said dryly to Blanche. "What you've just said made nice hearing." What did you expect me to do?" Blanche cried. "Did you think of anything better yourself? You stood there like a stuck pig. He came upon us without warning. He's got the sharpest pair of ears in the kingdom. If by any chance he heard our last words, it was the only way to put him off the scent. And instead of blaming me, Philippe, you'd do better to congratulate me." "Don't begin again," said Jean. "Let's walk towards the stalls and stop looking as if we were plotting." They moved forward, looking unconcerned, and acknowledging the bows in their honor. "Monsieur," said Jean in a low voice, "I must tell you that it's you and your ridiculous jealousies that cause all the trouble. If you hadn't started groaning here about what you suffer at the Queen of Navarre's hands, we wouldn't have run the risk of the king hearing too much." Philippe went on, looking gloomy. "Really," Blanche said, "your brother is much more agreeable than you are." "Doubtless he's better treated, and I'm glad of it for his sake," answered Philippe. "No doubt I'm a fool to allow myself to be humiliated by a woman who treats me as a servant, who summons me to her bed when she feels inclined, who sends me about my business when the inclination has passed, who leaves me whole days without a sign, and pretends not to recognize me when we meet. After all, what game is she playing?" Philippe Daunet, equerry to Monseigneur the Count of Valois, the king's brother, had been for 3 years the lover of Marguerite, the eldest of Philip the Fair's daughters-in-law, and he dared speak thus to Blanche of Burgundy, the wife of Charles, Philip the Fair's third son, because Blanche was the mistress of his brother, Gautier Daunet, equerry to the Count of Poitiers. And if he dared to speak thus to Jeanne, Countess of Poitiers, it was because Jeanne, no one's mistress yet, nevertheless was a party, partly from weakness, partly because it amused her, to the intrigues of the other 2 royal daughters-in-law. She arranged meetings and interviews. Thus it was that in the early spring of 1314, upon the very day that the Templars came up for judgment, the very day this serious matter was the crown's main concern, of the 3 royal sons of France, the eldest, Louis, and the youngest, Charles, were cuckolded by 2 equerries, one of whom was in their uncle's household and the other in their brother's, and all this was taking place under the auspices of their sister-in-law, Jeanne, who, though faithful as a wife, was a benevolent go-between, finding a pleasurable excitement in living the loves of others. The report that had been given the Queen of England a few days earlier was thus very far from false. "In any case, there'll be no Tower of Nesle tonight," said Blanche. "As far as I'm concerned, it won't be any different from previous nights," replied Philippe Daunet. "But what makes me absolutely furious is the thought that tonight, in the arms of Louis of Navarre, Marguerite will say the very same words that she has so often said to me." "That's going too far, my friend," said Jean with considerable haughtiness. "A little while ago you were accusing Marguerite, quite unreasonably, of having other lovers. Now you wish to prevent her having a husband. The favours she gives you have made you forget your place. Tomorrow I think I shall advise our uncle to send you into his county of Valois, for several months. Your estates lie there, and it will be good for your nerves. At once, good-looking young Philippe calmed down. Oh, madam, he murmured, I think I should die of it. He was much more attractive in this mood than when angry. It was a pleasure to frighten him, merely to see him lower his long silken eyelashes and watch the slight trembling of his white chin. He was suddenly so unhappy, so pathetic, that the two young women, forgetting their alarm, could do no other than smile. You must tell your brother Gautier that I shall sigh for him tonight, said Blanche in the kindest possible way. Once again, it was impossible to tell whether she was lying or telling the truth. Oughtn't Marguerite to be warned of what we've just learnt? Said Aunay hesitatingly, in case she intended tonight. Blanche can do what she likes. I won't undertake anything more, said Jean. I was too frightened. I don't want to have anything more to do with your affairs. It'll all end badly one day, and I'm really compromising myself for nothing at all. It's quite true, said Blanche. You get nothing out of our good fortune, and of us all it's your husband who's away most often. If only Marguerite and I had your luck. But I've no taste for it, Jean answered. Or no courage, said Blanche gently. It's quite true that even if I did want it, I haven't your facility for lying, sister, and I'm sure that I should betray myself at once. Having said so much, Jean was pensive for a moment or two. No, certainly, she had no wish to deceive Philippe of Poitiers, but she was tired of appearing to be a prude. Madame, said Aunay, couldn't you give me a message for your cousin? Jean looked covertly at the young man with a sort of tender indulgence. Can't you survive another day without seeing the beautiful Marguerite? She said. Well, then I'll be kind. I'll buy a jewel for Marguerite, and you shall go and give it to her on my behalf, but it's the last time. They went to one of the baskets. While the two young women were making their choice, Blanche at once selecting the most expensive trinkets, Philippe d'Aunay was thinking again of the meeting with the king. Each time he sees me, he asks me my name over again, he thought. This must be the 10th time, and every time he makes some allusion to my brother. He felt a sort of dull apprehension and wondered why the king frightened him so much. No doubt it was because of the way he looked at you out of those over-large, unwinking eyes with their strange, indefinite color which lay somewhere between gray and pale blue, like the ice on ponds on winter mornings, eyes that remained in the memory for hours after you had looked into them. None of the three young people had noticed a tall man, dressed in hunting clothes, who, from some distance off, while pretending to buy a buckle, had been watching them for some little time. This man was Count Robert of Artois. Philippe, I haven't enough money on me. Do you mind paying? It was Jean who spoke, drawing Philippe out of his reflections, and Philippe responded with alacrity. Jean had chosen for Marguerite a girdle woven of gold thread. Oh, I should like one like it, said Blanche. But she had not the money either, and it was Philippe who paid. It was always thus when he was in company with these ladies. They promised to pay him back later on, but they always forgot, and he was too much the gallant gentleman ever to remind them. Take care, my son, Monsieur Gautier d'Aunay, his father, had said to him one day. The richest women are always the most expensive. He realized it when he went over his accounts, but he did not care. The Aunays were rich, and their fiefs of Weimar and of D'Aulnay-le-Bondy, between Pontoise and Luzarches, brought them in a handsome income. Philippe told himself that, later on, his brilliant friendships would put him in the way of a large fortune, and for the moment nothing cost too much for the satisfaction of his passion. He had the pretext, an expensive pretext, to rush off to the Hôtel de Nesle, where lived the King and Queen of Navarre, beyond the Seine. Going by the Pont Saint-Michel, it would take him but a few minutes. He left the two princesses and quitted the mercer's hall. Outside, The great bell of Notre Dame had fallen silent, and over all the island of the Cité lay a menacing and unaccustomed quiet. What was happening at Notre Dame?